Thank you, Kate, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to Steve for helping to bring me here. Thank you to Wade and the Dean Erica for also making this possible, and to all of you for coming. I'm honored. I insecurely emailed Wade and Kate earlier in the week to say, but I don't know anything about the Canadian criminal justice system. So I am going to focus on the United States, which I happily do know something about. And then I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions, because I'm hoping we can have some discussion about the material I present, but also about a kind of comparative law discussion about your system here. Just make sure to kind of read me in a little bit about any specifics. And I also do a podcast, Kate mentioned, about American politics. So if there are questions about the impeachment inquiry that, of course, is going on television today, or other related matters, I'm happy to talk about that as well. Good, okay. I wanted to start by talking to you about the topic I chose and how I arrived at this subject. Several years ago, I was interviewing a conservative Republican district attorney in Los Angeles. And he told me a story that he saw as formative for his work from back when he was what was called a baby prosecutor in the early 90s, the mid-90s. He had just joined the office, and a case came into the office about a man named Gregory Taylor. And Gregory Taylor was accused of unscrewing the hinges of a screen door in a food pantry at a church to get inside at about 5 in the morning because he was hungry. And so this case came in to the LA District Attorney's Office at a moment when California had a very harsh 3 strikes law on the books, where your third offense would put you in prison for life. Didn't have to be a violent offense. Basically anything would do. And this case could be counted as a third strike for Gregory Taylor. He had a criminal record, not actually a violent record, but he had 2 prior drug offenses that he'd been convicted of. So Steve Cooley, who was telling me the story, watched as one of his colleagues, who was also a new prosecutor, decided what to do with Gregory Taylor's case file. And this other prosecutor decided to charge Gregory Taylor with a third strike for breaking into the food pantry. And Taylor was convicted, and he was sentenced to life in prison. And Cooley told me this story because he thought that if that file had landed on his desk, he would not have made the same decision. And that moment, watching that unfold, had convinced him that California's 3 strikes law was too harsh. And so as the now elected district attorney many years later, he was fighting to try to make that law more merciful and apply to fewer people. So that was the lesson he drew. It was about changing a statute. I listened to that story and thought, wait. The fact that Gregory Taylor's case landed on one prosecutor's desk rather than another determined the whole future course of his life. How's that possible? I had just never thought about prosecutorial discretion in those terms before. Once I noticed the discretion that prosecutors had, I started to see it everywhere in my reporting in the criminal justice system. And that's really what led me to this course of investigation and to trying to understand what role prosecutors are playing. What I found was that this element of prosecutorial discretion in the United States system is a real driver for this slide you see behind me, which is about how incarceration has risen in the United States. So as you can see here, back until the late 1970s, the United States had a fairly low incarceration rate, not very different from Canada, not different from countries in Scandinavia. And since then, we have just skyrocketed in the number of people we put into jail and prison. If I was showing the Canadian rate on this slide, it would be basically where that flat line is in the United States until the late 70s. And that's true of many other countries in the world. What's happened in the United States is exceptional when you think of it in international terms, not, I would argue, in a positive sense. And what I want to try to show you today is I think that prosecutors and the way in which their discretion functions in our system account for a lot of that rise that you see behind you. So how did this start? In the 80s in the United States, there was a rise in crime. and a lot of fear generated by that rise, and a lot of effort on the part of American politicians to capitalize on that fear, to win election by promising to lock up the people who were committing harm. And so you see first a kind of wave of sentencing laws pass in every state that are ratcheting up sentences across the board. They are using a particular tool of sentencing reform or change called the mandatory minimum sentence. So basically what happens is that it's no longer in the hands of judges to decide how someone is going to be punished after conviction and sentencing. Instead, the legislators are trying to tie the hands of what they see as soft judges by saying, well, if you are charged and convicted for this particular offense, then you have to receive at least this kind of punishment. That changes almost everything about the American system. It was designed to make sentences harsher, but what we didn't talk about really very much at the time was that we had also shifted an enormous amount of discretion from judges to prosecutors. And the reason for that is that once you have mandatory minimum sentences, you are really baking the punishment into the charging decision. And in the United States, it's prosecutors who decide what kinds of charges to bring, and also what kinds of plea bargain offers to offer in the end. So you have this initial charging determination, and often you have some flexibility about whether someone pleads guilty to the highest maximum offense they're charged with or to a lesser included offense. Those decisions, charging absolutely and plea bargaining for the most part, are really in the hands of prosecutors. And we also see criminal codes expanding in the United States in the 80s and 90s. Lots of additional kinds of charges get added. And that allows prosecutors to do this thing called stacking, where for one offense you can be charged with multiple different crimes. And again, that allows you to face a heavier punishment. And those decisions, again, are really in the hands of prosecutors. So this slide behind me here is from a researcher at Fordham Law School named John Pfaff. And his work was really fundamental to my own thinking about this issue. So I was out there as a journalist hearing stories about the power that the prosecutor was wielding. And then John does this study that really provides a kind of empirical foundation for what I was seeing out in the field. What John found was that in this period, the one I showed you before, in which incarceration is going up so dramatically, we also see prosecutors change how they're using their charging power. We see them go from charging felonies in about a third of the cases that come to them to about 2/3. And again, what's important about this is it really isolates the role of the prosecutor in this push to increase incarceration. This is a decision that prosecutors make independent of the police. It doesn't depend on arrest rates. And they're also making this decision independent of judges and the rulings that they're making in the courtroom. And I think when you see this kind of statistic, this isolating of the power of the prosecutor, and then you put it together with this increase in mandatory minimums, which every state in the United States has at least one and usually multiple mandatory minimum punishments in place by the end of the 90s, when you see all of this, I think what you're seeing is a kind of shift in the classic image of American criminal justice. So we usually, in the United States, and I think here too, imagine that you have a judge at the apex of a triangle, and then you have a defense lawyer and a prosecutor at the bottom two corners on a kind of even playing field with the same kind of bargaining power. As a result of all the dynamics that I was just describing, I think what we've seen in the United States is that the prosecutor has really moved up to the role of the judge in terms of their real-world decision-making authority in a lot of criminal cases. And that is very much at odds with how our system was designed, right? We gave judges as the kind of neutral, unbiased decision-makers more power because of their impartiality. Prosecutors in the United States are not supposed to be impartial. They have two roles. They are supposed to be ministers of justice, which does provide some kind of overall concern about the system, but they're also supposed to win convictions. And in a world of fear of crime and concern about public safety and an assumption that locking more people convicted of crimes up is the way to keep people more safe, what you see there is an incentive and a kind of culture that grows in a lot of prosecutors' offices that really prioritizes winning convictions over any other kind of value. And we see this in a number of ways. One of the illustrations I find really useful is something called the Hammer Award, which existed in an office in Memphis that I did a lot of reporting on in my book. And you can find variations of this throughout the United States. The Hammer Award in Memphis goes to the assistant district attorney who wins a big trial, or gets someone to plead guilty to a very heavy sentence, or even wins a death penalty case. And what happens is that if you're in the DA who's accomplished that, you get this picture of a hammer posted outside your door. There's like a kind of recognition of you at an office meeting. And what all of that does, of course, is show that in this office, this is the kind of work that we see as valuable, that you get recognition for, that could lead to a promotion. And I think that kind of office culture, which became really common in the 90s and 2000s and continues in a lot of offices in the country, really helps explain why you have prosecutors playing the role that they're playing in mass incarceration. So here I wanted to show you a kind of a quote, a recognition, somewhat unusual, from the district attorney in Brooklyn, Eric Gonzalez, who is a character in my book, about the different facets of a case and how prosecutors control in some way, or at least heavily influence every phase that a criminal defendant goes through. Arrest, to deciding charges, to making a request for bail, and then to deciding what kind of plea bargain to offer. And I think because prosecutors, rather than judges, are making so many of these determinations, what you see here is a kind of separation of fear of crime and criminal and the rate of crime from incarceration in the United States. So in the 80s and for part of the 90s, these two phenomena are following the same pattern. There's a kind of sensible relationship here. Crime is rising, more people are going into prison. I'm going to try to complicate or question whether that's really the best way to deal with rising crime, but you can sort of see a rational relationship here. Then, sometime in the late 90s, you see these lines cross. And so now I would argue what we've built in the United States is this giant machine of punishment. And in large part because of the decisions prosecutors make, it is continuing to operate at this very high velocity, even though, as you can see, our crime rate is falling a great deal. These two different trend lines have just totally separated from each other. They're no longer in any kind of rational accord. Now, I don't want to tell you that prosecutors are solely responsible for this. That would be an oversimplification. The police and judges and legislatures and citizens are playing a role in this too. But I think that understanding the role of prosecutors is crucial to changing that relationship. And feels of a sense of urgency to me, because that line where you now see that incarceration is finally starting to decline slightly in the United States. If we only continue to decline at that same rate you see up there, it's going to take us 75 years to bring our incarceration rate down by half. If we were going to come and meet you guys in Canada where your incarceration is, we would cut our incarceration rate by more like 75 or even 80%. And so what I see here is a phenomenon that prosecutors help build, and in a few minutes I'm also going to try to explain to you why I think that prosecutors have now a chance to be a shortcut to making that line come down much more fast than it otherwise would. First, though, I want to talk about how the system is actually functioning, especially with regards to money bail, because this was one of the big surprises to me when I did my reporting for my book. So I thought the reason that we use money bail to decide whether people go to jail before a trial as opposed to being released was that they had to have some skin in the game in order to come back to court, right? Like if you pay some money up front, that's going to be your incentive to show up. If we're using money bail to play this role in the United States, it must be because it's necessary. So it turns out that's just absolutely not true. First of all, the United States and the Philippines are the only two countries in the world in which for-profit cash bail is even legal. There's a reason for that. You and lots of other countries have outlawed cash bail because you worry about extortion and abuse. You worry about putting private actors, bail bondsmen, and bail bond companies into this quasi-governmental role in which they're sort of vigilantes in the kind of work they do, supposedly rounding people up, but they're also in some way representing the government. It is also true that in the United States we know that cash bail is not necessary to get people to come back to court, because Washington, D.C. and the state of Kentucky have been operating without cash bail since the 1990s. And you know what? Almost everybody in those places come back to court. The way it sort of roughly works is that there is a small percentage of defendants who are accused of violent crimes, and judges make individual determinations that they could be a real risk to the community or to an individual if they're released. And so they are held in jail with what's called preventative detention. But it's a small percentage. It's about 8% in Kentucky and about 10% in DC. Everybody else is released. And of that much larger percentage, almost everyone, something around 90% of people, come back to court, even though they have put no money down. It turns out what's really important for getting people to come back to court is making sure that they know when to come back. So sending them texts to remind them, being really clear about the dates, kind of following up with them in a variety of ways. It does not take the threat of jail or the payment of money to accomplish this goal. So if bail is not serving the purpose that we in the United States say that it is serving, what's it actually doing? The answer really is that bail turns jail into a kind of plea bargaining mill. And what I mean by that is explained by the study I have up here on the board. Actually, first let me explain one thing, and then I'll explain the slide. What I mean by that is that you're more likely to plead guilty if you're in jail. We know that, and it's kind of obvious, right? Like if you're in jail and you are worried about whether you're going to lose your apartment, how you're going to pay your rent, what's going to happen to your job and your kids, you're going to be much more likely to sign that piece of paper that's just going to get you out. And much less likely to think about the longer term consequences of having a criminal record, which you're going to carry with you for the rest of your life. But there's this weird, to me, surprising element of what bail is also doing, which is that people who are held in detention in Texas, this is a big study in the Houston area, those people turn out to be more likely to commit crimes 2 years out after their convictions than the people who were released. Now, this seems counterintuitive, right? Like we're holding them in jail, that's supposed to be improving public safety. These are people we've already identified, they've been accused of crime, so keeping them out of the public sphere, that should be reducing crime. In fact, if you go 2 years out, it has the opposite effect. And that's because of this problem of jail being what's called criminogenic. So you guys know the word carcinogenic, it means something that causes cancer. The idea that jail is criminogenic means that jail is actually causing people, is associated with people committing more crimes afterward. And again, when you stop to think about this, it actually makes a lot of sense. Because of those same kind of sense of desperation I mentioned earlier, people who are worried about losing their homes, people who have been in jail and get out and don't have a place to go, don't have a job, have a lot of trouble getting hired, people in those kinds of circumstances become more likely to commit crimes. And so when I was reading this research, there was this calculation at the end of this study that just blew me away. The idea that if Houston had just let out of jail all the misdemeanor defendants who were only being held for $500 or less. Like, these are not dangerous people. If they could have come up with $500, the state would have let them out. If the state had in fact let them out, they actually could have prevented 4,000 new crimes in the Houston area over this period of time. And that notion that bail is actually counterproductive, that holding people in jail pre-trial is having this warping effect, this disadvantageous effect on public safety, that was really surprising to me. So I also want to talk about trials. In the United States, we have the right to a jury trial in our Constitution. It's something we pride ourselves on, and it is still the main feature of any kind of television show or movie, and a lot of books that are about the criminal justice system. There's a trial in my book. Trials make for great drama. And they remain our kind of classic image of that triangle I was talking about before, where you have a judge with a gavel at his elevated desk making these rulings, and you have lawyers arguing in our adversarial system for their different positions. This is supposed to be how we get at truth in the United States justice system. In fact, because prosecutors are able to stack charges and able to threaten mandatory minimum sentences, We have almost no trials as a matter of percentages in the United States. We are at a point where something like 98% of convictions in most states are obtained through plea bargains. So one of the problems with that shift in our system is that, again, it gives prosecutors rather than judges these key decision-making authority. And another problem is that it means that these basic decisions about justice are being made in secret, in kind of private haggling sessions between defense lawyers and prosecutors, not out in public in court in a way that the public can clearly see and that we can track. And I think one of the biggest problems with this shift in our system is that we've lost a really important check on the power of the state, and especially the power of the police. A lot of times, or at least sometimes, the government does not follow every single rule when they arrest someone. They might conduct an illegal stop or an illegal search. They might pick up evidence that they're using against you that they shouldn't have in the first place because they didn't follow the rules. Or maybe they don't have very good evidence. You may never find out any of that because you may be in a position where there is a lot of pressure on you to plead guilty, given this heavy sentence you're facing, because of stacking charges and mandatory minimums. And a result of your guilty plea, this evidence is never going to be examined. We're not going to find out that the police broke the law. We're not going to find out that the case against you was really weak because your case is never going to go to trial. When I talk to groups of prosecutors and judges in the United States, this slide is the most controversial thing that I present. And the reason for that is if 98% of your convictions are obtained in a certain way, it's going to be hard to imagine that you could do without the very feature that is providing this kind of resolution, right? Plea bargains are the oil that keeps all the wheels of American criminal justice moving. And so what prosecutors and judges tend to say to me is like, we can't give this up. Are you imagining a system without plea bargaining? And my answer to that is not that I'm imagining a system without plea bargaining, though those systems exist in Europe. They are such a departure from the way we do justice in the United States that I kind of don't dare to advocate for that. But I do think we could go back to where we were not that many years ago, to a system that had a higher proportion of trials and thus was reigning in the government's power in a way that it no longer is. So one of the main reasons that we've arrived at this world of lots of plea bargains, apart from the kind of statutory authority that prosecutors have gained through sentencing laws, is the American Supreme Court. And I want to talk to you about 3 wrong turns, I would argue, that the Supreme Court has made. And these are old cases. They date from the 1960s and 70s, but they are very much still with us. The first one involves a horse groom in Kentucky named Paul Hayes. So Paul Hayes had a few younger siblings he was helping to take care of. His mom was sick. He wasn't making enough money. He passed a bad check at a grocery store to buy about $85 worth of groceries. He got arrested, and the prosecutor said, if you plead guilty to this crime, I will support a 5-year prison sentence for you. And Paul Hayes said, $5 for an $85 check, that seems like way too much. I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to roll the dice, and I'm going to go to trial. And the prosecutor said, okay, if you want to go to trial, I am going to charge this bad check as your 3rd strike. They had a 3 strikes law that allowed for this in Kentucky at the time, and Hayes had a criminal history. And if you lose a trial, because this is your 3rd strike, you are going to go to prison for life. So Paul Hayes took the gamble. He went to trial and he lost. And he received that life sentence. And then, on appeal, his lawyers went to the United States Supreme Court, and they said basically, look, this is just too harsh. There has to be some constitutional limit on the threat that a prosecutor can make when they are trying to convince someone to plead guilty. This is a form of coercion to be able to say that you can send someone to prison for life if they want to exercise their constitutional right to go to trial. And the United States Supreme Court said, you know what, sorry. We think Paul Hayes knew what he was doing. We think there is even enough negotiating and bargaining power between the prosecutor and the defense. We're not going to set any constitutional limit on what prosecutors can threaten in order to induce someone to plead guilty. This is still the law in the United States. You can face the death penalty if the prosecutor thinks that the charges warrant that, and that is a way that you might be convinced to plead guilty to a crime. And because of this lack of a limit, I think that's part of another element of understanding why the number of plea bargains has gotten so high and the number of trials has gotten so low. Another, I think, really problematic result of this decision is the number of people in the United States who have been found to be wrongfully convicted, who've been exonerated, but who pled guilty to their crimes. Now, how does that happen? If you didn't do it, why would you ever say, I plead guilty in court? The reason might be that you're facing such a heavy sentence and you don't think the jury is going to believe you. We know that 18% of the couple of thousand people who've been found to be wrongfully convicted in the US since DNA technology in the late 80s, 18% of those people pled guilty to their crimes. The second decision I want to highlight for you is from 1975, Imbler versus Passman. This is a decision in which the Supreme Court had to decide how to handle the problem of prosecutorial accountability. So if you have people who have all the power of the state behind them, and they do something wrong, they commit misconduct, they hide evidence, they manufacture evidence, they put someone in prison who they know doesn't deserve to be there, what is supposed to happen to them? What the Supreme Court did in Imbler versus Passman was to make it very difficult for anyone to sue a prosecutor personally. So prosecutors have what's called absolute immunity, which is unusual. Lots of government actors in the US have what's called qualified immunity. The police have qualified immunity. It's hard to sue them. Absolute immunity means that you basically cannot be sued personally for anything you do in the course of your duties of employment. That's what prosecutors have in the US. And when the Supreme Court gave them this absolute immunity, the court said, don't worry. If a prosecutor gravely violates someone's constitutional rights, someone else will come along and prosecute that prosecutor. You know what? In my research, and other people have done this too, I have only found 2 cases in the modern era in the United States where a prosecutor went to jail even for a couple of days for violating someone's constitutional rights. It turns out prosecutors are not super eager to go prosecute other prosecutors. It just doesn't really happen. The Supreme Court also relied on this notion of professional discipline by an association of the prosecutor's peers. That's the State Bar Association in the US, the people who hear complaints about lawyers. This is also a route to prosecutorial accountability that has proved to be almost worthless. It's very unusual for prosecutors to be disciplined by their state bar associations. There's a chapter in my book involving an ethics trial of one of the prosecutors in the case of Nora Jackson, who's one of the main characters in my book. And if you read the book, and I'm happy to describe this more in the Q&A, if you're curious, you see that this ethics trial is not really going to provide a realistic route to any kind of discipline for this prosecutor in Nora's case, even though in her case the Tennessee Supreme Court had found that the prosecutor had withheld evidence at her trial. The last case I want to highlight is often one that we view as a kind of iconic, heroic case in the US. It's called Gregory versus Maryland. It's the case that gives defendants the right to see evidence that could help them prove their innocence. And that is a crucial element of our system because if you have the police and the state, they're the people who have the power to investigate, they get to rope off the crime scene, they interview witnesses. It then becomes really important that if they discover that there's another suspect, a way for you to show that you're not the one who did it, they have to turn over that evidence to you. The problem with Gregory versus Maryland, the reason that I would argue that right now in the US it's operating in a kind of half-empty manner, is that it only obtains a trial. So if you're one of those vast numbers of people who plead guilty, this does not help you. There is no constitutional right from the United States Supreme Court to see the evidence that could help you prove your innocence unless you're on the brink of trial. There are a bunch of federal appeals courts in the US who have extended Brady to the plea bargaining phase, but they differ on how early you actually get to see that evidence, and it is not a universal right in the US. The way Brady really works right now in my country is that it is a total patchwork. There are states in which all you've got is Brady, and it's really up to the prosecutor's office whether they're going to share something with you any earlier. And then there are states that, especially Texas and North Carolina, that have created their own protections for defendants to be able to see the evidence against them, and indeed even almost all the evidence of a case. And Texas and North Carolina have modeled early access to this kind of evidence. Like a lot of things in the US, when you have a lot of variation among the states, what ends up happening is a kind of laboratory of democracy. It's great for me as a journalist. You can go around, interview people and prosecutors in states like North Carolina. How's it working for you? What I heard when I did that kind of reporting was that prosecutors were very wary of providing more evidence to defendants. This is called open file in the US. They thought that that was going to be harmful to witnesses, harmful to victims. They worried about the whole integrity of the system. They found that they actually were able to work perfectly well with this kind of rule. If you are worried about the safety of a witness or victim in a criminal case, or you're worried about witness tampering, you can go to the judge and try to redact the witness's name and contact information from the material you turn over to the defense. And guess what? The judge will almost always listen to you because they take that kind of public safety concern very seriously. Despite the fact that something like 90% of prosecutors in North Carolina now say that they are comfortable with open file, every time another state in the US starts debating this, the prosecutors there act like this is a totally crazy idea, as if they're not really speaking to each other. So this happened last summer in New York. The New York legislature was debating what's called an open file statute, and the New York district attorneys got together to oppose it. Someone in Texas, the lead prosecutor, held a press conference to say, hey, New York, you know what? We do it this way in Texas and it works just fine. It was sort of a way of making fun of New York. You know, Texas often gets a reputation for being very tough on crime, maybe not like the most defendant-friendly state, but in this case, Texas had tried something that was working perfectly well, and they wanted to say to the state of New York, you know what, you also can improve on this 1963 rule from Gregory versus Maryland. So this is a point in my lecture in which I get to take a deep breath because I've described a lot of problems to you, and when I started working on my book in 2015, I have to say those problems looked pretty insoluble. To my pleasant surprise, I started watching a movement grow to elect a different kind of district attorney in the United States. Now, electing district attorneys, like cash bail, is something that we are almost the only country in the world that does. You do not have elected prosecutors in Canada, and that is probably better. But since we do have elected prosecutors in 45 out of 50 states in the United States, it was lucky for me that I happened to start reporting this book at a moment that a movement started really across the country to try to start looking for people to run for DA who wanted to reduce incarceration and make the system more fair. And so this is a way, again, of trying to jumpstart the, and create a shortcut to bring down the mass incarceration rate. Because if you take all this prosecutorial discretion and power and you put it in the hands of someone who wants that light blue line to come down a little faster, well, maybe that's going to start to happen. Maybe there's a way in which you can harness all of that power to try to reverse the effects of the system that we created for a different kind of world. One of the heartening things to me in working on this book is that this movement to elect different kinds of prosecutors and to reduce incarceration has increasing bipartisan support. You can see here that when you ask these survey questions of all Americans, you get high percentages. You even get a majority of people who voted for Donald Trump. That is also true if you ask people about the kind of candidates that they are interested in voting for, and about whether they understand that incarceration can have this counterproductive effect on public safety. One of the other features of this effort to elect new district attorneys is to try to change the demographic composition of United States prosecutors. There are about 2,400 elected prosecutors around the country. In 2015, 79% of them were white men, and you see the tiny percentages of people of color on this slide. So in 2016, which was really the first year that this national movement to elect progressive prosecutors took off, prosecutors ran in about 15 big cities and metropolitan areas across the country on a platform of reducing or even trying to end mass incarceration. A lot of those candidates were women and people of color, and to my surprise, when I woke up after the election on November 2016, which was kind of a memorable election in our country, what I found was that about a dozen of these folks had actually won. And you see that the new DAs who are coming into office that year and since then have a different kind of demographic profile. And some of them talk a lot about the lived experience they have. They have family members who've been incarcerated. They grew up in neighborhoods where there is a concentration of crime, where there also tends to be over-policing. They just bring a different kind of experience to this job. And then the next question is, how much can they really change how their offices work? So this is a very new study. This study just came out last week. But it shows, I think, why the prosecutorial reform movement deserves to have so much energy behind it. What you see here is based on data from 1996 to 2016. And you see that when you elect a Republican district attorney in a contested election, the incarceration rate goes up significantly. When you elect a person of color in a contested election, the incarceration rate goes down. And what's crucial about these findings is this line at the bottom of the slide. No significant effects on crimes and arrest. And so I think what you see here is really proof that the discretion of prosecutors can be exercised in quite different ways that have an enormous effect on how many people are going to prison and on the health and well-being of the communities they're coming from, right? Because when you rip people out of their social fabric, you cause a lot of damage to families and communities. But this kind of difference that we have here does not necessarily translate into increased public safety in the way that I think a lot of voters and Americans have always assumed. And to say just a little more about these elections, what really drove these candidates to run for office were community organizers. So people often from the Black Lives Matter movement who'd been protesting the police from about 2013 or 2014 on. They were starting to look around and say, what are we actually delivering to our communities? We've gone out there and we've protested, but we can't necessarily unseat the police chief. That person is appointed. What can we do to really change the system? And they seized on prosecutors, these local elections that were not that expensive to influence because they don't tend to have lots of people paying attention to them. And also, not that many people vote in these elections in the United States. They tend to have low turnout. Sometimes they're held in off years. And as a result, if you can get your people out there, if your constituency gets behind a candidate, you can have a really good shot at changing the person who's in that office. And it matters what that person looks like, what kind of lived experience they have. What really matters the most is who they're accountable to. If they're accountable to the people who are the most affected by mass incarceration and who want change, then they're going to be trying to fight for a different kind of system. It's also worth saying that in several of these elections, as the community organizers got going and good candidates started coming to the fore, there was also money that came in from big donors in the United States. Some money from one of the Facebook founders, not Mark Zuckerberg, but this other guy named Dustin Moskovitz. His foundation and PAC was really important, his political action committee. And also George Soros funded several of these candidates. I bring this up later on because that was not the kind of driving force. Often the money comes in fairly late, kind of after you've proved yourself as a candidate. But it is a really interesting example in the United States of seeing movement bubble up from the grassroots and then also get support from elites at the top. And I also want to make clear that this is a bipartisan phenomenon in the same way that those slides I showed earlier were. Some of the reformers who won are conservative Republicans who are coming in to reduce mass incarceration but also clean up some corruption that was going on in the DA's offices. And states like Texas and Georgia, and I already mentioned North Carolina, have also separately, Oklahoma, have been separately passing reforms statewide that bring their incarceration down, very high incarceration rates down just a little bit by changing sentencing laws. I want to shift a little bit here to talk about solutions to crime and public safety that lie outside the criminal justice system. One of the reasons that we created this phenomenon of mass incarceration was that we believed that the only way to bring crime down was to turn to the courts and the police and to locking people up. It turns out that's just not true. Sociologists have been doing research for years that shows that one of the biggest factors that influences whether a community has a high crime rate is this kind of intangible factor called social cohesion. And what I mean by that is you can take one poor neighborhood with very similar racial and ethnic demographics as another neighborhood and find wildly varying crime rates in those two places. So what's going on there? Another sociologist, not Pat Sharkey, but an older or more experienced, I should say, sociologist named Robert Sampson, did a lot of work in Chicago where he actually sent cameras around to just cover what was happening on the streets day after day in a couple of these differently crime-affected neighborhoods in Chicago. And what he found was that the neighborhood with the low crime rate had a lot of street traffic. And you could see that people were talking to each other out on the street. They were kind of looking out for each other. And when he went and did interviews, he found confirmation of this. Yes, I know my neighbor's name. I can, help my neighbor if they need me to take in a piece of mail. Sometimes I look after the kids of people who live near me. Just the sense that people were helping to take care of each other. That makes a tremendous difference, it turns out, in preventing crime. And it also is linked to this finding up here from Pat Sharkey, which is another thing that just sort of blew me away in my research, that when you open a community nonprofit organization in a neighborhood, you can actually see the homicide rate decline. It doesn't have to be a nonprofit that's working directly on preventing crime. It can be something like mental health treatment or drug treatment or just health in general. It can be something like turning a vacant lot into a playground. All of these kinds of work in a community help bind people together. And that is a way of preventing crime that has nothing to do with law enforcement. And we spend far too little money and pay far too little attention to that opportunity that we have in the United States. I also want to talk about how we think about who is a criminal. This slide is from New York City, so it's about how people drive cars and how infractions for driving count, and it's also about the subway. It's only the subway, it's only cheating on the fare on the subway that counts as a criminal infraction among these various options. And I think the point of this slide is that it is no accident that people who ride the subway are much more likely to be poor and much more likely to be people of color than people who are blowing through the easy pass lane. So we're making a choice here about who gets punished for conduct that is not necessarily any different from conduct that we treat with much more sort of deference and respect. And we're also making a choice in how we deal with people who have guns. So this is a harder part of my lecture because it's not about something like subway fare beating, which maybe it's pretty easy to agree is not worth putting someone in jail for. This is about conduct that's much closer to violence. And what I want to point out here with this slide is that in the US, we have higher rates of gun ownership, legal or illegal, by white people. And yet we have a much greater chance that the people who are going to be arrested and convicted for having guns are black. This has to do with how we police certain neighborhoods. It has to do with how we give out gun permits. There are a lot of factors going into this. But I think until we reckon with this kind of disparity in punishment for gun offenses, we're not going to really figure out how to reduce mass incarceration, how to address racial disparity, and I think we're also not going to really deal with why people have guns in the first place. So that brings me to a little clip from a podcast I made, which Corey's going to play, but not quite yet because I want to set it up. So when I was working on this book, I felt like I also wanted to do some storytelling through audio. And I made this mini-series. It has 6 episodes. You can download it for free on iTunes if you want. It's called Charge, just like my book. And it follows a young man named Terrari through his experience of being charged with gun possession in New York. And so just to give you a little bit of background here, in New York, if you have no criminal record at all, but you are caught with a gun without a license, the maximum charge you face, which almost everybody faces, because then prosecutors can get their plea bargains, that maximum charge carries a 3.5-year mandatory minimum prison sentence. And so that was the position Terrari was in when he was arrested, almost certainly illegally, but that's another story. He was arrested at his housing project in Brooklyn for having a gun. And so Terrari looked like he was going to prison, except that in Brooklyn, the only part of New York City this is true for, there's a little escape hatch for young people under the age of 24. If you have no criminal record, you get caught with a gun, you can plead guilty to the crime, so you have that sentence hanging over you. But instead of going to prison, you're eligible to get admitted to what is essentially like a social work program. It's a really unusual diversion from prison in the US, where the district attorney's office actually has a unit of social workers. And they work with young men like Terrari. They have a year, and the defendants in the program have to show that they're getting some education, usually passing their high school equivalency degree, getting a job, doing community service, abiding by a curfew, and staying out of trouble. So it's kind of like probation and parole, but it has more kind of a social work, weekly counseling element to it. So I watched Terrari go through this program during the year, and that's what my mini-series podcast is about. I want to play for you a short clip that involves a little bit of Terrari, but also a young man named Kadeem, who had a more serious criminal record in New York City and is now kind of passed through that part of his life and is become a youth advocate. Because he has this experience that's so relevant to people like Terrari who are younger than him, he's become someone who's really good at talking to kids about why they have guns and why having guns may be actually like a really bad decision that they're making. So I want to just play for you a little bit of tape of Kadeem and Terrari talking about this.
Over the 2 years I reported in gun court, I met a lot of teenagers who talked like Terrari. They said they never fired a gun, or only did it a few times, for practice. Most hid their guns, and also like Terrari, almost never at home. They were as wary of the weapons as they were proud of having them. They said they got the guns for defense. Here's Terrari.
I was bullied damn near my whole life. Like, I'm small. I got into a lot of fights, and I had nobody to ever protect me.
Many of them made basic Second Amendment arguments, like, it's a dangerous world, and you have to make tough decisions to survive in it. Here's another teenager I met in gun court.
It's sad that I say this, but I'd rather get caught with a gun and do 2 or 3 years at a time than not get caught with a gun while being bad.
The gun started to seem to me like armor the kids didn't really want.
You feel an added layer of security or power. Having a gun in like an urban culture has been associated with having like power or clout or relevancy.
That's Kadeem Gibbs. I met him when I started reporting in gun court. He was one of the advocates who worked that border zone between the kids maneuvering in the streets and the cops enforcing the gun court's new mandate. Kadeem knows that there are plenty of illegal guns floating around New York City. Every year, the NYPD seizes around 5,000 of them. Last year, 161 people were killed by handguns. The politicians look at those deaths, and they see a crisis. But for the kids Kadeem works with, this is just the hazardous ocean they swim in. Getting a gun for protection, it seems to make sense. Kadeem tries to convince them otherwise.
One thing that I always challenge young people on is protection. Like this notion of, if I have this firearm, I'm like invincible or nothing's gonna happen to me. That's false.
Kadeem knows what he's talking about. He speaks from the experience of his own childhood.
So when I was 12, was when I got arrested for the first time for bringing a gun to school. I started being in the streets around that age too because my mom was dealing with her own issues.
Kadeem's mom was struggling and she wasn't around much, so he felt he had to take care of his siblings. He started selling drugs, got caught a bunch of times. Long
story short, I ended up doing 5 different bids from the time I was 12 to 22.
He told himself the same thing as Terrari and the other defendants. He had a gun for defense. But even though you buy a gun for protection, you almost never use it that way. Kadeem learned that in the hardest possible way.
I was shot when I was a kid, and I had a gun on me when I was shot. It didn't make me bulletproof. It's like I still got shot.
voices of some of the people who I wrote about who are so affected by these big, sometimes abstract questions about prosecutorial power and who goes to prison. And for me, it really comes down to this very basic question about who deserves a second chance. People like Kadim and Terrari in the world I live in, often we write people like that off. We assume that they're too dangerous and scary, that they're not going to be able to function as kind of thriving, productive citizens. And we don't think enough about the fact that when someone like Kadim goes to prison, they're going to come back out. And what kind of position are they going to be in to really try to become someone who is no longer dealing with these complicated and really sad questions of how you protect yourself and putting yourself in harm's way because of decisions you're making. So I'm happy to be able to say that Kadim and Terrari personally are doing well right now. Terrari started community college in Brooklyn in September. His favorite class is accounting. He's hoping to become an accountant. And Kadim, who I actually just have a text from this morning, and I did an event with last week, is working as a youth advocate in New York and actually really wants to write his own book and do his own podcast. And so he's trying to apply for some fellowships to do that. So I'm going to end on that kind of hopeful note, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions.